Well, hello quilty friends, and welcome back to my channel, and thank you for coming back. So last week I did a tutorial for the piece blocks in my Sweet Land sew along. Here's the quilt, and did not realize it until afterwards that a lot of it I was out of the camera. And of course I went out of town after uploading and pre-scheduling it to come out and everything, and couldn't redo it right then. But I planned to, for this week's tutorial, is about the borders and things like that. And so I thought, well, I'll just do this again, and this will be part 2, so I can show you some of the segments from this block right here that we were working on. Because what I was trying to show you here on the ironing board was how to use my water brush, how I press my seams open, you know, how I use my roller, how I set up my blocks, how I, you know, just do all of that stuff. It wasn't, you know, I'm not showing you how to do an exact 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is all I'm doing on my machine. And so you don't need to see that, but you did need to see what I was trying to show you, which you could not. So thank you so much for all of the kind comments that you left and suggestions, and, you know, asking me, please don't give up, and, you know, you can do this by yourself. And obviously, you know, I don't have a staff. I'm not a quilt I'm a fabric designer and a pattern designer. I don't have, you know, a staff and employees. It's just me. So I'm trying to figure out how to do this on my own. I was taught never to give up, and I kind of have that mindset. I do not want to give up. I want to be able to film by myself so that I can do it morning, noon, or night, whenever I need to, and not have it planned out. And, you know, so that I can spontaneously get on here and show you a block that I'm doing here and there. And so I will get it figured out. One of the things I did was the main suggestion, which I obviously knew and thought I had, was a mark, but I was just kind of trying to pay attention to the fabric on the ironing board, and that didn't work. And so I don't know if you can see it, but I put a piece of washi tape right here so that I know that if I'm below this washi tape that you cannot see. So anything above is in the view. And then I changed the size of my ironing board. As you know, I make all of my ironing boards, I cover them, and I had a bigger one here, so I had a bigger block, so the camera was farther away, all that kind of things. And I don't know, that's a lot of information, but I think I've got it figured out. So let's see how this one goes, and hopefully you can see what I'm gonna do. So I'm just gonna kind of recap about this block. You know, I left the other video up, obviously, because there's a lot of good information, and you could see a lot of the things, and a lot of you said it was just fine, that you've watched my videos enough that you know exactly how I press my seams open and how, you know, how I piece, and that wasn't a big deal to you. So, but I do obviously want you to see what I'm doing. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the 4-patch and how I add my easy corner triangles on after my 4-patch, which is the section, this section right here. Okay, so I've already sewn 2 of the seams together, pressed the seams open, how I've shown you before, but I waited to sew them together because I wanted to show you how I pin with my double pins here. You know, that's what I've got here in this little container. And so what I do is I make those seams line up right there. I'm not worrying about the edges here, okay? I mean, obviously I want them to line up, but first this is what I'm lining up. And I take this double pin and I just stick it on both sides, okay? So you can see that it's coming out. Here, let's do it like this on the camera so that you can see. I'm gonna try not to poke myself. Okay, so you can see it's coming out both sides, right? So now I've got a pin on both sides of that, and that is not going to shift. Now I normally I wanna pin that again because I think I got it ski-wampus trying to go sideways. Okay, there we go. There we go. All right. I normally do not go like this and pin like that. You could, but I just feel like it distorts it and you don't really need to. All I'm doing is trying to get a pin on both sides of this, and then I can sew over it, or I can remove it right till I get to that point knowing I'm not going to shift, but I usually just sew over it and I just go over slowly. And so that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to stick my readers on, put that block there so you can kind of see what we're doing here. Now I'm getting to the pin, so I'm just slowing down a little bit so that I'm sewing over it. Okay, and then I just remove it and usually put it in my little pin cushion right here beside me so I can grab it again. Okay, so now I'm going to set this over here so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to set my seams and I'm going to open them up, and then this is where I like to use this because I like to make sure it's opened all the way. I don't have to, you know, saw back and forth, and you know, it just takes a second, but I know that if it's not opened all the way, that when I put the iron on it, that's going to press a little pleat in it and make your block go smaller and smaller, and I don't want that. So I want to make sure it's opened all the way before I put the iron on. And then I like to press. I try not to iron back and forth to distort. This is just a 4 patch, and so if I went back and forth on this a little bit, it's not going to be that big of a deal. But when you're sewing things on an angle, like flying geese, like I'm going to show you, and things like that, it's so easy to distort those blocks. And then what I do is I just throw a clapper on there and let it cool down. Now I normally leave it until, you know, you can't feel any warmth anymore from the clapper so that it lies flat. But I'm not going to be leaving the clapper on quite as long as I usually do each time, just, you know, just because I want to speed this along a little bit. And so what I'm going to do for this section is I need easy corner triangles here. Okay, and so I've got this one, and okay, I've got 2 of them marked here. Now I marked them for you just so that you could see the angles, but I normally, you know, when I've shown you last time on my Seam So Easy guide, you don't need to mark that. Now you can do that. You can grab a pin if you want. I normally don't, but I'm just going to be sewing on this line, you know, this way. But you can stick your little pins in there. When I'm marking, I like to use just a mechanical pencil and my marking ruler. See, and I just lay it down like here from corner to corner and mark when I'm sewing from corner to corner. If I'm doing another method, which I've shown before, these are a 1/2 inch wide, then I'll mark on each side, and that's when you're making 2 easy corner, 2 half square triangles at a time. So anyway, I'm just going to take this over to the machine and sew these 2 seams. From corner to corner, I'm going to go right directly on the line and sew. I normally, like I say, do not mark because I use my Seam So Easy guide, but you know, you do you. If you've got a Seam So Easy guide and you love it, then you don't have to mark. And you know, if you've got another method, you know, that's great. Once again, I'm just showing you how I like to do things and how things have worked for me. But there is no quilt police, and I'm certainly not the quilt police, and there's always, you know, many different ways to do things, and you need to do what makes you happy and the methods that work for you the best. But I do enjoy teaching, and I do enjoy, you know, doing my videos, and hopefully, you know, some of my techniques and some of my piecing that I've taught over the years, you know, may help you in your piecing. And so now I'm just going to bring this over, set the seams, and that's what it's going to look like. So I trim them off. You can use a rotary cutter if you'd like, but you know, you've already got your seam sewn. You don't need to do an exact 1/4 inch seam allowance. You just need to, you know, get it there and get it open. Okay, and then I use my little roller. I'm just pressing enough to make sure that is all the way open. Now when I have these little intersections here where I have more seams on top of each other, I make sure that that's open by just kind of going back and forth a little bit. All right, and now here is where my water brush comes in. So this is just water in here. It doesn't need to be anything else. And all I'm doing is squeezing it right here and applying a little bit of water, right? Just, I'm not doing it along the whole seam. I'm just doing it right where those seams line up, and I'm just getting a little bit of moisture there. Now this is, I do this so that I don't use steam on my iron after, because even if I've starched my fabric, even if if you apply heat, if you apply water in any form with a spray bottle after you've pieced your block or with a steam iron, it's going to shrink your cotton. And I don't want my blocks to be shrunk. And so what I do is I just press those down just on the seam allowance using a little bit of water. Whoops. And I showed you last week that you just take the top off, fill it up with water right there, and put the top back on. And then it's got little area here that's comfortable for you to squeeze on. And I put the lid here, and you can use quite a bit. You can go quite a way, many blocks with this water, because you're only using a little bit. And I usually just use a couple. Meaning I have a backup filled already. This is what the package looks like that I showed you last week. But it's just been a game changer for me, because I just wanted it a little bit flatter right there. And see how flat that is? That's nice and flat with all of those seams. And by pressing open, I really have a nice flat block segment, okay? And then I just do the same thing with that. I press open and press together, and then right here, let me show you this segment right here. Okay, so I'm going to trim those off. And I'm going to press these open. And I'm not going to apply the brush or anything, because see how there's no intersecting seams yet. So it's just, that's easy to just stick a clapper on there, right? This is going to take me a little bit longer because I am a little bit further away from the camera. You know, usually I'm clear up here, which now you can't see, but that's why you couldn't see. I kept pulling my work closer to me, thinking the camera went all the way to the front of my ironing board, but it did not. Okay, so now I've got those, and these two get sewn together like this, and I do the same thing with these. And this is one of the things I wanted to show you. These are going on an angle when I'm putting them together. Okay, these seams are going on an angle this way, but I still, you know, use my double pins. And I should have just stuck that one back in my pin cushion like I normally do. And so I just simply pin, still going on both sides. It doesn't matter, you know, if it's on an angle. I just make sure that I've got a pin on one side of the seam and a pin on the other side of the seam. And then I go ahead and sew that. And then when I get to the machine, when I said, yes, I want the edges to line up, then I line up the edges and begin sewing. And then I just go slow over the pins. Just using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If I get this question asked a lot, do you use a scant 1/4 inch seam, or do you use an exact seam? Or I try to use an exact, but if I have to answer that question, I would definitely use, it would definitely be a scant. If, you know, I don't really do that on purpose, but yes, I would definitely use a scant. Some people like to do that. I would never use more than a 1/4 inch. You know, your blocks just aren't going to go together. But see how on an angle, how nice they line up like that. And then I just open them up. And again, right there is the one I'm most concerned about getting open. Then grab that brush, and I'm just putting just water on the seam allowance, not on the rest of the block. I'm not going to shrink up the block or anything by applying water, and then heat just in that little area. Now, if I was to spray this down with a spray bottle or use steam, yes, this is going to shrink this section. Even if you've already pre-shrunk it or whatever, it just does it with the heat of the iron. That's just over the years, I've just learned that that's what happens. And so I also wanted to talk about when I'm squaring up, okay? So let's pull this in. There's my square that I marked. I'm gonna need that here. But this is my 4.5-inch trim it ruler. And this is where I lay that on there. And because I've got lines going diagonal and going this way, then there is a place that you can square everything up, okay? And so I've got a little gnat flying around in here. It's driving me crazy. So you can see right here that I can trim that up just a little bit. But I like to look at all edges before I do any trimming just to make sure. And I always use my little mat here because you can see how easy it is to turn it. And so I've just got a little teeny bit that I can trim off. And I just turn it, keeping it. I don't turn the ruler or anything. I just turn the mat with the corners so that I can. And so that you can see that that is just a little bit, right? But that's accurate now. That's an exact 4.5-inch square. And I do that with all the segments. This is the same thing. So I can put my little trim it ruler up there and lay it on there and look at that line going across the seams and see if I've got to trim anything up. And it looks like there's only one little section right here that's sticking up past that. Now, I talked about this last time, that if by chance this does not happen to be off, which is a good thing, but if by chance you've got a little area, like say this stuck down under and it doesn't come up all the way, then I usually just will grab a pin and stick right there so that I can keep in mind that that is a short area. So that when I go to sew it next to this, okay, I will, so say okay, it goes like that, but I'm talking about this area. Pretend it had to be sewn together like this, which it does not. When I lay that down there for the 1/4-inch seam allowance, I use the other one as the guide, just, because I have the knowledge that this is shorter, I know that I'm not putting that all the way to the edge like you normally do, because then it's going to be shorter on this end by pulling up this fabric. So I hope that makes sense to you. It's just, knowledge is power. And that's why I use my trim it rulers to trim them up. And if they're too large, which is most of the time what happens, I'm just trimming a little teeny bit off here and there. But when I do need to, when I can't trim any off because there's a shorter area, that's what I do, is I just stick a pin in there, and then I know that's like a little note to me saying when I go to sew them together to look at this again and, help me to piece more accurately when I'm putting my pieces together. Okay, so I hope that helps explain that. Now I wanted to talk about this little flying goose segment right here. That's part of the border fabrics that we're gonna talk about. So I just want to show you how I do that. But that is for this top of this section. This is the flying goose that goes on top of that. And so what I do is, once again, I just sew from corner to corner, but I can't do that and sew them both at the same time. I have to sew one side, and then I have to trim it and get it pressed right before I can add the other side to it, because at the top the seams, intersect or overlap, whatever you want to say. And so I just stick that on there. Again, no intersecting seams, so I don't need to apply any water to it. And so now, like I say, normally I would let that sit for a minute longer, but now I can lay that on there and just sew from here to here, right on the line. There's several ways to make flying geese, but this is the way that I chose to make them for this quilt because it's very scrappy, so you're not using all the same fabrics for every flying goose. When you're doing all the same fabrics, then I like to teach a method that's called fast flying geese that I've taught for a long time. And but because this is scrappy, we're just doing this the old-fashioned way, and it's really nice to be able to just cut squares and rectangles. And so the cutting process is much faster also. Okay, so now I'm just going to open that up. Grab that just at the intersections, get that a little bit wet. And when I say a little bit, it's you know, it's pretty wet. I don't worry about putting too much water on there or anything. I just stick that iron on there and see how that's also nice and flat already before I even put the clapper on. But for those of you who maybe have not seen my videos or heard me talk about the clappers before, these are the quilter clappers from Riley Blake. And this is the shorter size. I typically have 6 of these that I use because I like to stack things on top of each other and go out because I like a smaller area. So in other words, maybe this was time to trim and press this one. I'll just show you, which it is. This is another angle. I would open this up. And a lot of times it helps to have it on a harder surface. Why not? But if I'm trying to go up, I don't necessarily have to do it on top of the clapper, but I can, is what I'm saying. Sometimes I just do that if I'm doing the same segments over and over again and I'm trying to save space and I've already got other things under the clappers, you know, cooling off and that kind of thing. Then let me make sure I'm getting up in here so you can see what so I can see my mark and see what I'm doing. Okay, let me get the iron in here. I didn't use my roller on this, but I'm just trying to demonstrate another thing here, right? So I'm just putting that on there, getting that nice and hot. I like to use vintage irons. Once again, there's many reasons why I do, and I explain that in my vintage iron video, and I talk about how you can find them and how you know which ones to buy and where you can find them. So as always, I'll leave a link about my irons because I always get questions about that. So in every piecing video, I always leave a link about my irons. Okay, so that's one way that you can just like build up your, you know, you can go up instead of out, which is what I do with my design boards all the time, right? I go up instead of out because I like to work in a smaller area. Okay, so let's put these pieces down here. Missing this one. And let's lay this out. Well, first let's do this corner one. See this corner one? This one is a separate piece that just sews right on top of there. Okay, I will not use my double pins because I don't need to on that. There's a seam here, but there's not a seam here. So I will just line up from corner to corner and sew that. But this one, so you just lay out like this right here, but you have to sew this to this first, and then you can sew that to that. And then I've got this easy corner triangle right here that makes this section. After all of that is sewn together, seams pressed open, and use the water, you know, in the intersecting seams, then this will, you know, look like this, a solid piece, and I will just lay that on there and just sew it from corner to corner. And that's what I showed you, you know, in the last video. Okay, so that you end up having it so that you can sew in. This is what I showed you, is these two sections right here. Now I can't show you this entire block because obviously I told you I brought my camera in closer, and this is a 16.5-inch block. But this piece right here will measure 6.5 inches unfinished before you sew it into the block. And this right here will measure 4.5 inches square. This will be 2.5 by 4.5. And then when you sew them all together, it'll just be, you know, 3 by 3 by 3. And then just like a 9 patch, just like I showed you before. Okay. So I hope that by seeing that, you know what I'm talking about. And I can go on to the borders, which is what we're going to be talking about. So in this quilt right here for this week is now we've got all the blocks done. I've already done this tutorial for all of the sashings. And so what we need to do is just the pieced border, okay? And so that is all flying geese. And then in the corner, there's 4 patches. So there's four patches in the corner. You know, I didn't feel like I needed to show you how to do that, but here's the 4 blocks right there. These are all just 2.5 inch squares. Of course, all of the cutting, once again, is in the sew along guide here, right? This is the sew along guide for the sew along, and it tells you all of the fabric, everything, schedules. I keep my notes in here. There is a place in the back that you can keep, oh, I took that paper out. I've taken some of the papers out so I can show you details on what I want to do, but this tells you literally everything you need to know about the sew along, which dates, which tutorials are, and all of that kind of thing. Okay, so I've got the 4 patches, and for the border, it's just flying geese, 2 flying geese stacked on top of each other. So what I mean by that is I've got some of these sewn. These 2 are sewn together. I haven't pressed it yet because I wanted to press open and show you how I do that with the water brush. But you can see that they are 2 flying geese. This is one and this is one. And some of them consist of having the background fabric color cut 2.5 by 4.5 with printed 2.5 inch squares on the corners. And then the other one is actually the color is the 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangle, and you put background squares on there. And so by doing that, when you join them together, this is not necessarily in order, but when you join them together, you can see what that's forming, right? And it's very scrappy. And I just think it's fun. Okay, so that's what we're doing. So all this is just flying geese, and just like I showed you with this one right here, that's exactly how I do them. Okay, I just simply do one side first. You can mark, or you can just use your Seam So Easy guide and go from corner to corner. These, let me pull these back in because I forgot to tell you, but once again, you know, I trim up as I go along. These should measure 4.5 inch square, so you'll be using your 4.5 inch trim up ruler a lot for the border. But what I wanted to show you, why I have my 2.5, and one of the things I tried to show you last time that you could not see because I was out of screen, was when you have sewn one, you can actually use both of these. Now I do have rulers coming that are 2.5 by 4.5 trim it rulers, which would make it easy, but for right now, I've just got a 2.5 inch and a 4.5 inch, so that you can use both of them together or singly to give you a clue on what this looks like. Because see, you've got this line, you know it's supposed to be 2.5 inches tall. So you've got this line that you can line up there, and you can see if you've got anything sticking up past here on one side, and then you can flip it over here and kind of look on that side. So basically it's helping you height-wise, but this, by having to go back and forth, is not really helping you width-wise, right? But then you've got this that you can lay on there. But if you go like this to where you would maybe want to trim your lines are not intersecting this way. So look, you can go like this, and the 1/4 inch seam is on the bottom. These Aqua shows you where your seam allowance is going to be and what your block's going to look like. And there are little dots up here that shows you this 1/4 inch seam. So I can see right here that I need to trim just a little teeny bit off of this width right here in the corners. And that's usually where it is. It's from Easy Corner Triangles. It's just you know, just trimming a little bit off those corners. And then I've got one on this side right here, all the way down, okay? And again, it's just a little sliver, but it makes such a big difference. Sometimes you've got more than a little sliver that you needed to trim off. And so that was important. And so that's all we're doing. This one obviously happens to be red. But for this border, we're using all of the backgrounds and all of the scrappy blues, right? And so in the Americana collection. So on this one, I just wanted to show you how I got to the point of these right here. So I left it there. I just sewed those two together. Now, before I open this up, I want to explain one thing. When you're sewing these two units together, I'm going to be sewing where there's a point right here that I don't want to cut off. So when I'm putting these right sides together, I can either sew from here to here, right? Or from here to here. I prefer to sew with this side up, not this side up. The point on this one is over there, and I'm not going to be sewing that into anything yet. So when I have a choice, I always like to choose this side up so that I can see I'm doing my 1/4 inch seam. But what if I'm getting to the point and I know that I'm going to cut it off by a little bit? I can always just adjust, and that doesn't bother me. This is cotton. It has a lot of give in the fabric. And you know, you can just kind of bring your needle over a little bit if you need to, just by a needle's width, if you need to make sure that you do not, you know, sew into that point. I like it right directly onto that point. Okay, so that's what I've done. I've just gone from here to here. And then I set my seam like you showed, like I showed, not you. And then open it up here. And this, I really, again, want to make sure I bring this in here because I want to make sure these are open. I do not want to have pleats in here. Even though you can't see them, maybe because it's such a small pleat, I just want this open all the way. And so then I know that it's going to be as accurate as possible. And then I've got 3 areas here, right? And it doesn't matter if there's a drop of water on there, it's just fine. You don't need to worry about putting too much water on. I just do it right here. And this is going to be really important because it's going to be so much more accurate when your seams are open and flat, especially when you've got a seam like this that you're trying to do. That's a lot of fabric. And so once I've got that to that point, then this is where I really try to press and not iron back and forth unless it's just a little bit like this. Sometimes I kind of, out of habit, I just kind of rock back and forth. I don't know if it's just trying to get that heat in there or what, but this is also why I like to use a smaller iron. Those vintage irons are smaller. The irons nowadays so many are big, even the ones that say they're small. I can't see what I'm doing. Like, it's going to distort my patchwork, and that's just my opinion. If you love I'm not trying to, you know, I hate saying things like that because I don't want to make you think like you're doing something wrong if you're not using a vintage iron. I'm just telling you, you know, why I love vintage irons. I grew up using them. Of course, you know, my grandma taught me to sew, and so that's what we always had. And they get really hot. Like my vintage irons, I never have higher than medium setting. If I did, I would scorch right through my fabrics, and it gets really hot. And that's just one of the things I talk about in my video about, you know, setting the heat, making sure you always buy an iron that has a heat dial on. Sometimes those vintage irons don't even have a heat dial. It's like, well, you can buy it for looks if you want to go on your cute little, you know, vintage shelf, but you don't want to use that because if you cannot control the heat, you're not going to be able to sew with it. It's just going to be way too hot. Okay, so look how nice and flat that is. And so these are all the border pieces, and let me see where I put my trim it, my 4.5 inch trim it ruler. They're all going to be 4.5 inches. Let's see how that lines up and what I've got to trim off. And see, these lines on here is nice that you can have that lined up like that. I can see right here I've got just a little teeny off the corner. I turn it this way, don't have anything there. It's going all the way to the edge. I've got 1, You guys with your bird's eye view can see that even better than I can, because I'm looking at it from the side and you can see it from the top. I don't know if I have anything to trim off there, but it doesn't hurt to just go like that. And then I've got these little slivers off, and that's what that looks like. Now, I like to use this size of my cute cuts. This is a 5x8, and I always have this by my machine when I'm using smaller segments. But if I have to trim up by using larger, you know, like my 6.5 inch trim it ruler or something like that, then I have my next size up mat, which I should have brought one in just to show you, but it's just another smaller size that's just up a size and still fits on here, and I can still turn it freely. And so that's what I do for those border segments, and then I'll just work on one row at a time, you know, and then sew those together. So let's talk about, let me move this out of the way so I can see my mark. Want to make sure that I'm in camera as I'm talking. I don't need that anymore because I've talked about that. But this is what I've got, a little setup here. Okay, this is my setup here. I took my papers out of my sew along guide, and what I have on each board that I have stacked up and cut are what is on the board. Okay, so I've got these ready to go, and I just stack them up there. See, so that's what I've got ready to go there. Now on some of these, there's two that are the same, and so this is one that I had already sewn, one like that, and so I put the extra kind of one that matched up. And when I say matched up, I'll tell you in a minute what I'm talking about. But that's all I did, was I took my 10-inch design boards, and I have 8 on each, and if I happen to have some that are double, these are single, but some of them you do 2 exactly the same, and that tells you in the guide, okay, in those pages, it tells you exactly which ones you're doing. These are all numbered in the guide, just like, let me see if I can pull a paper that has 2 of them on there. I don't know. I don't have that example right here, but see up here, this says this is number 17. Okay, if I had another one exactly like this, it would say number, you know, 32 or something like that. It would have both of them, and then you'd know if you need to make 2 or 1, but you know, this tells you right here, make 1. It's very easy, very self-explanatory. Now, when you go to put them together, let me move this stack out. Again, this is all in the sew along guide, but I'm just kind of explaining so that you know what I'm talking about, because that's what we'll be working on this week. Is when you go to put them together, seeing this right here, this shows you 1, 2, these flying geese up here are the numbers that are on the top, and these are the numbers that they go with, right? So this one right here is 1 and 18. Okay, so I knew that that's what needed to go together, and they're all numbered in the guide, so you know exactly what needs to go together. And this corner, let's see, what do I do with my 4 patches? Let me grab those and see which one that is. They're even numbered as well, so you can tell which is which. So that is going to go like that, and that's going to go like that. And it tells you exactly, and this is one border, this is the second border, and that's how you know about that. Now, I don't know if these are in order, but I just kind of want to show you right now so that you can kind of see how this border forms. So I'm just laying these on here like I did before. So you can see as we're going across, see what that looks like. Now, I haven't started doing the side border, so I know this isn't correct, but it's still the same kind of fabric placement. But see how you're going down the side? And that's how that forms that border down there, right here in the corner. See how that forms that? Now I'm all worried you're not going to see everything that I want to show you, so I'm going to move things up a little bit, put that there. That's above the mark, so I know you can see that. And see how fun that is? I just love the scrappy look of this, okay? And so that's what we're doing this week. This border, this border, this border, and this border, which consist of 4 patches for the corners. And this is all the same fabric that's in the corner. Notice this same print right here. That's in the corner. I thought that was fun to place those there. And then when all of your borders are complete, when it's time to sew your block together on page 72, it shows you, it tells you what fabric, whoops, excuse me, to cut your inner borders here. And so what you're gonna do is you're gonna have 3 different borders on each side after you simply put your block center together. That shows you how to do that too on another page. But, and we've talked about that before, all your blocks will need to be 16.5 inches square. Then, you know, do your sashing rows and all of that. And, you know, you've got your little stars in the cornerstones, which is the same, which I've already done the tutorial on, which is the same as these stars right here. That's in the center of the piece blocks. And then you're always going to do your sides first, okay? So you're going to add this side to this, and then the top and bottom. Then you're going to add this side, and then the top and the bottom one, okay? And then you're going to add the sides and then the top and bottom after you've added cornerstones to that top and bottom there, okay? So it's easy peasy, pieced border. It, as long as you know that you use your trim it ruler, that you can trim these up. It tells you here how long your border should measure and all of that kind of thing. When I'm doing borders, I like to pin from the center and go out and just kind of make that fit. And a lot of times, if I'm putting on a long border like this, when I say center out, I will pin from the center and then find the exact center by pressing in half, putting on the exact center here, lining the edges up, and then sewing and making it fit. I like to have my piecework up so that I know that I'm not flipping any seam allowances over or anything like that, but that's not always the rule. Sometimes you have to change the rules on, you know, depending what you're doing. So that's just kind of what I do when I go to do that. And so I'm excited to get this border done. I've been working on these pieces little by little, and I've been binge watching Emma, the new series Emma on PBS, on I think it's on Masterpiece, yeah, Masterpiece Theater. And I like to do that as I'm sewing, you know, these pieces. It's just kind of like non-thinking. I don't have to think about it. I'm just doing all of them, and kind of binge watching or listening to a book or something on tape. But I hope that this video was much better than the last video, so that you could see what I was doing. But please, if you haven't watched the last video, even though you can't see everything, go ahead and watch last week's too for other information about the inside blocks and things like that. And okay, now comes the time where I'm asking you to please leave me a comment again and let me know if this setup was better for you, if you liked this. And I appreciate your support. I appreciate you sticking with me, and I will chat with you later.